working today at our main 6-acre nursery and wanted to share with folks some observations I've been making in the landscape, the interpretations I'm taking from them, and it'd be interesting to get feedback from folks as well. So let me explain what I'm thinking. Since 2009, we've been planting hundreds upon hundreds of diverse shrubs and trees into this landscape. Fruit trees, nut-bearing trees, medicine-bearing plants, soil-building plants. Wildlife is doing that work as well. And it's pretty interesting the choices they make. Back in 2010, right near the home here, so we're on the west side of my folks' home, there are a couple characters at play. There's a grafted peach tree, which we planted. There's a Chickasaw plum, which is a suckering, thicket-forming shrub tree to the south of that peach. Those are the elements we put in with the idea the peach would be here, it would do its work for a little while, it probably would get some disease issues and pass away eventually. The plum would be able to fill in and take over. I thought it was a pretty decent design, complex enough, but the squirrels had better ideas. Thinking a peach and a plum is more than enough, the squirrel said, you know what? I think we can add a shagbark into this mix. And so this tree, I've talked about this in another video about this guild, where some of the curation, some of the stewardship was done by us, some was done by the wildlife, and in part, one of the roles you can play in an ecosystem is to set in motion certain things, but also to allow and enjoy seeing wild beings set in motion certain things. And so there's a thought initially saying shagbark hickory right here that makes no sense. But the more I think about it, and over the years it seems to have panned out, this tree just to the north of the plum has slowly but surely worked its way through the little bit of a gap that's here. Probably by next season, you can see the top of it. It will poke through the top of the plum and canopy out, and it will actually cast its shade to the north of the plum, which is compatible with our design, with the idea that this peach, which is now starting to show some disease issues and may fade out of the system in not too long a time, it can go away, and what we'll be left with is a thicket of suckering wild American plums with nuts with protein and fat raining down from above. The squirrel did an amazing job designing that in. I don't think I would have thought of that, and I really appreciate that they did. In a similar fashion, there's this old grandma cherry, another tree that we talked about in a guild video from a little ways back. I'll link to that here. And a number of years ago, another wild creature, probably a squirrel, almost certainly a squirrel, maybe a chipmunk, they put in this shagbark hickory about 15 feet to the north, due north of the cherry tree. There's a theme that's starting to reveal here. And in fact, this hickory did so well, this last year it made its first nut. Now the compelling part about this is there are no established hickories on this property. These squirrels are carrying them at least 200 to 300 yards to install these seedling trees into our landscape. So there's that old grandma cherry. She may very well pass away this year, giving an incredible light release to that hickory. I've followed the lead that these squirrels have shown me and added in a little more diversity. They put in the shagbark because that's the seed bank they had access to. I offered up a Carpathian walnut, Juglans regia, as well as a northern hardy pecan, both of which are thriving incredibly well. The hickory showed how well it can grow. We figured, well, some other members in that family, let's get the whole family gathering here, all to the north of the cherry, all getting just enough light to be able to establish themselves, really become strong beings in their own right, and once this cherry dies out, really take over that canopy. Some pretty nicely established examples of squirrels making decisions about how succession can happen in this landscape. There's also some very subtle and nuanced gestures that I'm starting to see as a theme. So for example, here's a spruce tree. Just to the north of it is a bitternut hickory, that mustard-colored, flame-looking dormant bud, bitternut hickory, which can be pressed for amazing oil and fat. This is another example. I did not bring this seed in. A squirrel chose to bring it and plant it here from at least 200 to 300 yards away. That is no small feat. Now what's interesting is the squirrel opted to take this bitternut and plant it just to the north of the spruce. And what's interesting to me is I'm seeing this spruce lean to the south, and 2 years or a year or two after it was planted, the spruce died. We since cut the top off, leaving it as a habitat, as a snag for some wild birds. But I wonder if the squirrels anticipated or knew that the spruce was going to pass away and planted this next level succession tree just to the north of it in anticipation of an imminent light release. Another bitternut hickory and another spruce. Again, we did not plant these. All the different places squirrels could have chosen to push these seeds into the ground, they are seeming to commit them directly next to trees that pretty shortly after they grow, so that's about a 2 or 3 year old seedling, this spruce has died. We didn't girdle it or poison it or anything like that. The spruce is now transformed into an amazing habitat for pileated woodpeckers. That's these massive holes that are happening here. And those will be occupied by smaller birds for housing soon enough. We'll leave this standing as a snag. It'll slowly fall apart over time. But again, the squirrels have designed in the anticipation of the death of this tree with a much longer lived, more appropriate for this region, very seriously dense food producing, fat, mineral, protein producing tree. They are some great designers and they work so hard. Here I see a beautiful little hazelnut seedling, which the squirrels planted. They took seeds from the hazels I planted in. Maybe intuitively I was taking a cue from them that I didn't understand yet, but I planted hazelnuts in and amongst these larch in here, and the squirrels have been taking that pattern and bringing it further along. They're planting more hazels around the bases of these larch trees. Here's another hazel, and there's another larch. So it's almost as though it's like a duet where the squirrels are planting them in, and I'm saying, well, okay, pop a hazel in, great. Another 2 to 3 feet to the north and east of it, I'll put in a wild plum, and I'll raise you by sticking a dormant blackcurrant cutting in. So the dormant blackcurrant will provide some protection to this wild plum aromatically from rabbits and deer, and some miscanthus sticks to help them out. What I'm seeing in this larch grove is a number of these trees have gotten quite tall, quite spindly, and in fact their root systems are no longer super stable in the earth. A number of them are starting to lean over and getting ready to fall over. I suspect this grove of larch is on its way out. And I suspect the squirrels really know that that's what's happening too, because here's yet again another bitternut hickory being committed within a foot or two of a larch tree. I feel like I'm getting to a place that when I see a seedling nut tree being planted next to some sort of pine tree, I should take it as a signal that more likely than not, that pine tree is coming to the end of its road. Black walnut seedling, larch tree. And the root system of this larch is starting to flare a bit. One good, super strong, heavy wind and this larch may fall over, and the deep tap-rooted juglans will probably take over. If I zoom out here in a literal way and look right across the road, I see a picture that informs what's going on in our young woods. Here's a space, I wouldn't call it abandoned, they brush hog once in a while, it's a hunting ground, and the pines that are in and were in this space are pretty rapidly in decline as black walnut, shagbark hickory, and bitternuts come up into this space. You can see, well, that's an ash, but a nice thicket of black walnuts, more black walnuts on the edge, and shagbark hickory. Are the squirrels planting out every one of those trees? Most likely. It's in their best interest to do so. I suspect within my lifetime these pines will be gone and this will move over to a nut forest. I wonder what other species and what other diversity can be planted in and amongst this space. Could we be adding persimmons and pawpaws, other juglone-tolerant plants? Maybe we should ask some squirrels. Is it a coincidence that there are nut trees being planted right next to these pine trees? It's possible, but I suspect these squirrels have some pretty amazing design skills, and I've got a lot to learn by watching more closely how wildlife choose to facilitate succession in these landscapes. When I see young seedling nut trees going in next to pines, I take it as a cue now. Let me add a few characters myself, and let's see what can happen here. This spruce and larch grove that's in decline, I suspect could transition over to 20 to 50 different diverse, productive, long-lived perennial elements that can provide us a tremendous amount of food, and maybe most importantly, the wildlife. Thanks, squirrels. I've got a lot more to learn from you. Got to watch these birds and watch these deer and learn more from them as well. And thanks for watching.